With just one season of evidence, the entire 2024 draft class would look so much differently if we could redraft it today. So we're going to redraft it today based on what we saw in 2024. Starting out with Jaden Daniels, I don't think this is particularly up for debate. Obviously, these rankings and the way this draft is going to go, this redraft will be based on Superflex rankings. And obviously, Jaden Daniels should be the 101, regardless of if you're in a Superflex league, a tight end premium league, or just a one quarterback league. Jaden Daniels, what he was able to accomplish in year one was absolutely ridiculous. This was probably, in my opinion, the best rookie season any quarterback has had. I'd probably put Ben Roethlisberger's at second, CJ Stroud's at third, Dak Prescott's at fourth. What Jaden Daniels did, he carried Washington. He carried them. That roster outside of Jaden Daniels was not very good, and the numbers obviously speak for themselves. What Jaden Daniels was able to do was absolutely ridiculous. And I just think that if you just give Jaden Daniels one more weapon this offseason, like maybe they get a wide receiver in the draft at the back of the first round, or maybe in the second round, give him a better offensive lineman here, maybe give him a better running back as well, Jaden Daniels is only going to go up. Quarterback 5 in 2024 is absolutely going to have a top 3 ceiling for the foreseeable future in fantasy football. And at number 2, I think a pretty decent number 2, but also a very clear number 2 in my eyes, just based on preference. I've got Brock Bowers at the 102. If I had the 102 in my draft and I could redo this past year's draft, I would have Brock Bowers here. If nothing else, only for tight end, just like the fact that tight ends come so rare. Right, so in 2023, Michael Mayer was the big name. Dalton Kincaid was the big name. Brock Bowers is what we wish those guys turned into. Brock Bowers, what he did in 2024 was absolutely crazy, because if you just look back to 2023 and what Sam Laporta was able to do, he was the rookie phenom at the tight end position. But if you just line the two of these guys' production up, what we have with Brock Bowers is a lot more sustainable. 153 targets, over almost 1,200 receiving yards, and only 5 touchdowns. And he was able to be the tight end one by a pretty clear margin of about 10 points. So what Brock Bowers was able to do with no quarterback in Las Vegas, no other wide receivers, like even if they have another good wide receiver, he's still going to be absolutely fantastic for the next foreseeable future in fantasy football. So just based on that premise right there, and the fact that tight ends are so rare to find, I would personally prefer him over a guy like Malik Nabers. I think Malik Nabers is going to be the clear 103 in this redraft as well. But I do think that it's a definite clear favorite towards the tight end position, because wide receivers, elite ones, are a little bit easier to find than elite tight ends in Dynasty Fantasy Football. Malik Nabers, though, what he was able to do is it's very similar to what Brock Bowers was able to do in year one as well. What Malik Nabers did was he was the wide receiver 7 in half PPR, had over 170 targets, 1,200 yards, 7 touchdowns, again, with no stable quarterback. Like, that's the common thread between those two guys, is that they showed elite traits with no real answer quarterback here. And I think that the Giants probably have, and I know it's a weird thing to say, probably have more lasting issues than I think the Raiders do. I think the Raiders, with ownership, with Tom Brady getting more involved, they're going to be headed in the right direction here, especially now that since they have Pete Carroll. I don't think that the Giants have any direction. They're keeping Brian Daboll, who I think is a good coach, but they've got so many other issues on that roster. I just don't really know what they're doing at quarterback here in the next year or so, because it's not like this is a strong quarterback draft. And that does make me nervous for the trajectory of Malik Nabers, unlike it does with Brock Bowers. Now, moving on to number 4, I think at the 104, there will be discussions here and people who disagree with me. I'd go Bo Nix. Bo Nix at the 104. He's my second favorite quarterback in this class in Dynasty right now. Because when I look at Bo Nix, obviously what he was able to do in fantasy this year, he was kind of up and down. You know, the beginning half of the season, he was not having fantastic success. He was definitely throwing a lot more picks in that year. He was definitely not throwing as many touchdowns. It didn't really click with him until the back half of the year, and then he really went on a tear, if you remember. Like, he was a viable streaming quarterback for so many teams that were looking for a quarterback, and were dealing with Patrick Mahomes, who was underwhelming, or dealing with Aaron Rodgers, who was underwhelming, or Caleb Williams, who was underwhelming. Bo Nix was kind of the answer. Bo Nix, 66% completion percentage in year one, had almost 4,000 passing yards, 29 touchdowns compared to 12 interceptions. Really cut down on those mistakes. And I think what it is for me that really separates him from Caleb Williams, from Drake May. Not that those guys can't run, but Bo Nix had a lot of success running the football. He had 92 carries, 430 yards, and 4 rushing touchdowns. Like, this is a guy who is not going to be Jaden Daniels. He won't be Lamar. He won't be Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts. But he will have games where he gets in a rushing touchdown or maybe rips off a 30 to 40-yard run here or there. Bo Nix, I just think with Sean Payton, it's the perfect fit. I do think that they're going to get more receiving options, more, it's like a Washington rebuild, right? They're going to get more weapons over time, and Bo Nix will have more success. I think there's just a more stable foundation here for Bo Nix to be more successful than the other quarterbacks who will go over here in a little bit. I've got Brian Thomas Jr. at the 105. And I think there's a very, very good argument that you could have Marvin Harrison Jr. over him at 105, but I've got Marvin at the 106. Now, I think I went through it in a previous video. I think that if you say that you're taking Marvin Harrison over Brian Thomas Jr. at this point in Dynasty, you're lying to yourself. I think you really are. Because what the difference here between Brian Thomas Jr. and Marvin was, obviously their production speaks for itself. Brian Thomas Jr. was a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy in his first year. 133 targets, almost 1,300 receiving yards, 10 receiving touchdowns. And Marvin Harrison Jr., wide receiver 29. Wide receiver 29 in half PPR. And he had 116 targets as well. So it's not like he wasn't getting targeted. Now, I think the difference here between these two guys is we have two guys that have quarterbacks that we definitely view as on different levels, right? Most people would pick Kyler Murray as a better quarterback in the NFL than Trevor Lawrence. Now, Trevor Lawrence wasn't even there for a good part of the season for Brian Thomas Jr., and he was still able to be a top 5 wide receiver. Well, Marvin had Kyler the whole time, and Marvin couldn't crack the top 25. So I think that there's just definite hurdles for Marvin that he did not clear in his rookie season, that at this point, I can't see myself picking Marvin over Brian Thomas Jr. if we had to redraft at all. I think he's just got more hurdles to clear. I like Marvin. I still think he's going to be a good dynasty asset. I think he still is a good dynasty asset, but I'm not taking him over Brian Thomas Jr., who showed elite fantasy traits in year one, and Marvin just did not. What I will tell you with Marvin Harrison Jr. is that I do think that when you look at a place like Underdog had him ranked so high this year. They had him ranked inside the first round. So if you wanted him, you had to take him in the first round. I think that based off what he did this year, he's going to be more of a mid-round guy. And I really like that future price for Marvin Harrison Jr. So if you do want to draft Marvin Harrison Jr., you can actually start drafting early for best ball in 2025. If you're sick like me and you just want to draft Marvin Harrison Jr. today in that range that he's currently going in by going down in the comments below and grabbing the link that's there and using code FFN to sign up for Underdog. When you put in your first deposit, they will match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash, and you will be able to get in on some early best ball drafting for 2025 fantasy football. Now, at the 107 here, again, sticking with this whole thing with quarterbacks, I think that there's definitely a case to be made for Drake May to be over Caleb Williams, but I've got Caleb Williams at the 107 and Drake May at the 108. So with Caleb here, now there's a lot of things that have gone into this in my decision to go with Caleb over Drake May. Obviously, if you just look at their success in year one, neither one of them had a ton of success. They both definitely had some moments, right? Caleb Williams had he had some really good games. Drake May had some really good moments. I wouldn't say Drake May ever put together a really good fantasy-worthy game. Like Caleb Williams, he definitely was able to do that more often than Drake May was able to. But I do think that just looking forward and looking at what these two teams have to offer. So obviously they both, in my opinion, get a coaching upgrade. Now the difference here is that Chicago went offense first round. They decided to go with Ben Johnson, the genius offensive coordinator from the Detroit Lions. I think that was a smart move for Caleb Williams, if nothing else. I think their offensive line is definitely going to have issues here. But he's got more weapons as well than Drake May does in New England. Drake May has an offensive line problem worse than Chicago's. He's got a weapons problem worse than Chicago's. And Mike Vrabel, although I like him a lot, is a defensive coach who he just hired Josh McDaniels as his offensive coordinator. I just don't know if that's going to really mesh well at this stage of the NFL. I think that Josh McDaniels was best suited for the 2010 era of NFL. It's just a lot different than it was when he had Bill Belichick as his head coach. I just have more faith that Caleb takes a step forward in 2025 than Drake May does, and I think this is a very critical year for both of them. So I personally prefer Caleb over Drake May at this point. At the 109 here, I think a lot of people are going to think that this guy is really late to the party. I think a lot of people are going to disagree with this ranking. We'll discuss it. Ladd McConkey here at the 109. I think it's a really good range for him. I think when you just look at what Ladd McConkey did this year, obviously you're going to be like, why is he not higher? Like, there's no way he should not be higher on this list. Listen, I agree that Ladd McConkey was great. I was bigger on him than a lot of other people in the fantasy football space amongst content creators heading into his rookie year. I projected him to have a 1,000-yard season, and he was awesome. He was huge for me personally as I won 15,000 on Underdog because of Ladd McConkey's excellent Week 17. But Ladd McConkey here, I just think it's important to note this. He had 112 targets in his rookie year, about 1,150 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns. I think it's also just important to remember, like, what was around him. What was around him was just not very good, right? He definitely did not have a viable number 2. Like, different weeks it would be Josh Palmer's the number 2, and then it would be Quentin Johnston's number 2 if Quentin Johnston came to play that day. That's not what they're going to do moving forward. The Chargers are absolutely going to invest in a top, like, not maybe a top wide receiver in the draft or anything like that, but they're going to make changes here, try to get a more true X wide receiver, and they're going to want to relegate Ladd McConkey to slot duties. Now, that's not to say that Ladd McConkey will not have more seasons as a top 12 wide receiver. I believe he's this generation's Keenan Allen for the Los Angeles Chargers here. I think he's still going to be very viable, but I don't think that we should overreact off of this past season that we just saw with Ladd McConkey and say, yes, he's going to be a top 10, top 5 wide receiver moving forward. I don't think I see that. I think he's going to have more hurdles after this offseason. Obviously, if they don't do anything this offseason to address the wide receiver position more, he will move up for sure. I'm just projecting that they will do something about wide receiver, and that's why I'm not overdrafting him based off what we saw in 2024. Now, at the 110 right here, I think this guy it's going to be interesting to see what the reaction here to Bucky Irving at the 110. Bucky Irving, I think, from what I've seen creators that are not as high on him. I've seen creators that are really high on him. I think with Bucky Irving, there's a lot to look forward to here in the future with him. Bucky Irving obviously comes in, does really well as a running back for Tampa Bay. And why I say as a running back, obviously he plays running back. You know he's a running back. But what he did was he took over this backfield for Tampa Bay. And he really, the interesting thing with Bucky was that coming into the NFL, I kind of thought after seeing what he did in the combine with his size and his speed, I thought he'd be more of I thought he'd be relegated more to a receiving back role once he gets to the NFL. That's really not what happened. He took over the backfield, averaged 5.4 yards per carry on 207 yards, over 1,100 yards rushing, and really the receiving was kind of an afterthought. Like, he had 52 targets, which is great, but he only had less than 400 receiving yards and no receiving touchdowns. Rachaad White was actually the more effective receiving back for Tampa Bay. But the thing you gotta like about Bucky Irving here is that Bucky Irving is 22 years old. So Rachaad White is already going to be 25, almost 26 years old heading into the 2025 season. With Bucky Irving, you've just got more years to come. And I get it. With Bucky Irving, he wasn't a top pick. He wasn't a day 2 pick. But with Bucky Irving, he just served too much of an important role in this offense on a good team, playoff team. I don't see them moving on from Bucky Irving, at least in 2025. Maybe they move on if he has a bad season in 2025. I think he's got a bright future. This guy did really well on limited opportunities for a lot of the year. Didn't really claim that really big role until about midway or even 3 quarters into the season. I think he's got a really big year ahead of him, and I think he's got a bright future ahead of him as well. Now, at the 111 here, I've got Michael Penix at the 111, and I do think that it's important to note this. With Michael Penix here, obviously we didn't get to see a ton of him in 2024. They should have went to him sooner. I was screaming about that for weeks before the Falcons actually made the change over to Michael Penix. I was saying they should absolutely already be on to Michael Penix at this point, but they didn't do it until late. So when you just look at Michael Penix's numbers right now, they don't look great. 61 completions, 105 attempts. That's 58.1% completion percentage. Not good enough. Absolutely not good enough. You will not last in the NFL if your completion percentage is below 60%. 775 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. So this guy obviously was just not getting the job done as far as that department goes. I think that it's obviously important to note, you can't just throw this guy in when they threw him in and expect him to be super successful. I think what Atlanta did with Michael Penix actually potentially maybe damaged his career. That's not to say that I think that Michael Penix is going to be screwed moving forward. Obviously, I still like him inside of the first round of a 12-team Dynasty rookie redraft. I still like him inside the first round. But I do think it's just important to note here that what they did with Michael Penix clearly showed a lack of direction in this franchise. They have no idea what they're doing in Atlanta. I'm not convinced that just because they moved on to Michael Penix at that time, I don't think that they know what they're doing. I think that what they did potentially damaged his career a little bit. Obviously, he's got weapons, though. He's got tons of weapons. Drake London. I don't know if Kyle Pitts will be there much longer, but he's got Bijan Robinson. He's got a good offensive line. I do think he has a lot of pieces there to help him move forward. But I ultimately am concerned about the direction of this franchise and just what they're choosing to do, just off of decision-making basis. I just don't think that what they did with Michael Penix in his rookie year was going to be healthy and effective for him moving into 2025. That's the reason I'm a little bit lower on Penix than I am with Bo Nix, than I am with Caleb Williams and Drake May. And to round us out in the first round here, I like Xavier Worthy at the 112. Xavier Worthy basically around where he was drafted last year. This is basically the area here. I think Xavier Worthy, what's important to remember here with him is that Rashee Rice was not here, right? So Rashee Rice being out absolutely forced Xavier Worthy into a bigger position than I think even the Chiefs really wanted him to be in year one. Now, it's also important to note that the majority of the season, he was not coming through on the hope that we had as a first-round pick. He was not coming through in the bigger role they wanted him to play. And I think the reason why Kansas City didn't want him to be in a bigger role in the first place is because he wasn't ready for it. And I don't even know if he even will be a consistent volume guy in the NFL. I don't think he is. He's not big enough to be a consistent volume guy and get hit over the middle of the field. I just do think that his career trajectory will be a little bit more limited than I think it will be with a guy like McConkey. I do think that he's going to continue to serve a very important role in this offense, and just the way he's developed through the NFL playoffs has been really, really awesome to watch. But Xavier Worthy, I think just based on this year, we kind of saw a guy that is not going to be a dominant number one for your team. Rashee Rice is going to fill that role for the Chiefs for the foreseeable future when he is back healthy. Xavier Worthy will play a really good, important role as a deep threat, as kind of a gadget guy, and that's going to be very important in fantasy football in some weeks, but I don't see this guy as a consistent dominator, even with him just being a rookie this year. I just don't think that's in his skill set. So I still like Xavier Worthy. I still think that the team fit is obviously fantastic, but I'm not putting him over a McConkey. I'm not putting him over a Bucky Irving, where I do think that those guys will be dominators for the next several years. I don't know if I see that with Xavier Worthy. So let me know how you would redraft the first round of 2024. And if you want to see the top running backs in this year's class, click on this video right here.